Assalamu alaikum. We are going to continue yesterday's topic on John Dryden. Yes, I have changed the entire background because I was not sure that it was very much visible. I hope this looks better. Anyway, we saw a little bit about the life of the poet, the critic, and we mentioned his more prominent, more popular works. I forgot to mention All for Love here because that is one of the most often quoted, most frequently quoted works of his. Mm, we saw a little bit about his critical works. I did not elaborate on any of it, mainly because there is far too much. And each work did not hold one particular idea or thought or did not follow one stream of thought. Rather, it was composed of different aspects it was related to, except for this one particular work that stands alone in terms of a critical treatise as such. The rest of them were all written in connection to other works, his own works or translations of other works of other writers. And it's a pretty long list. Yeah. And we also saw the suitability of his criticism as to the style of criticism he employed, where he imitated it from, where he got it from, and how its limitations and its the opportunities it afforded him to work on further, mm, further along with the subject, as we see later on how he contradicts himself in various places. In one preface, he may champion one particular style of writing or certain form of writing, and in another preface, written a couple of years later, he might speak on the same topic, but would have a very altered view in the matter, altered opinion in the matter. Then we saw certain flaws in his criticism, how it was unsystematic, inconsistent, repetitive, interested, as in biased. And we also looked into some common themes in his critical writing, how he advocated the use of heroic couplet and yes, a rhymed couplet. Sir Robert Howard, who was his brother-in-law, I think, they had an ongoing argument concerning the rhymed couplet, use of rhymed couplet in tragedy, whereas Sir Robert Howard was not really, had huge objections to using of this couplet in for tragedy. He thought it was frivolous to use rhymed couplet. Dryden opposed him, defended its use. Then we saw his appreciation for Milton, Shakespeare, and Chaucer, and Fletcher, of course, and a little bit about his epic poetry and the prime concerns. His prime concerns. We looked into the nature of poetry according to him. It not merely he followed Aristotle to some extent. He agreed with Aristotle that poetry itself was a process of imitation, and poetry had to imitate, a poet had to imitate whatever facts there was of past or present, and popular beliefs and superstitions and things in their ideal form. Whereas the first one was quite was practiced by almost almost all the poets of his time. These two were in rather not a very popular practice of his time, and how he believed that this last would should be the prime concern of the poets of his time. And speaking of the nature of poetry, once again, we saw how the main focus should be on what things ought to be. Yeah? Now today we'll look into the function of poetry. What Dryden believed was the function of poetry. First of all, it should not be for its own sake. Poetry should serve a higher purpose. All right, Dryden believed that poetry should serve a higher purpose, as in it is meant for the reader or the audience. It is not meant for the individual alone, individual poet alone. So there was this art for art's sake school of thought, the aesthetic school, that believed that writing poetry in and of itself is a pleasurable task, and it did not require any impetus from which to grow from. Okay, and it did not require to serve any other purpose except for giving pleasure to the writer himself, or if there is a reader, to the reader. So poetry need not exist for its own self. It is meant for the reader, it is meant for the audience. All right. Now, Plato believed that poetry, the function of poetry is to instruct. All right. It has to teach something. And Aristotle believed that the function of poetry was to delight, to give pleasure. And Horace believed that poetry should both delight and instruct. Okay, both teach and give pleasure. And Longinus, he believed that poetry should transport. Here, this word transport has the implication that poetry should change you or elevate you to a higher level, to a higher order of thinking. Now, for Dryden, the main function of poetry is to delight and transport rather than instruct, and to realize that it did not merely imitate life but offered its own version of it. Right? So, according to Dryden, it should not merely delight, but it should transport. So he mixes both Horace's idea and Longinus' concept that poetry should both delight and transport rather than merely teach. And to realize that it did not merely imitate life, it not merely imitated life as was said by the classics, the ancients, but it should offer its own version of life, as an idealized form of life, as in a beautiful resemblance of the whole. Beautiful resemblance of the whole, as in bring in the idealized version of something or anything, any matter. Delight is a chief, if not the only end of poesy. Instruction can be admitted, but in the second place, for poesy only instructs as it delights. So the main purpose of poetry is to delight, and it could be the only purpose. If it instructs, it is an added bonus, right? So the main purpose of poetry is to cause pleasure, is to bring you, is to make you happy or sad, or some way it has to delight you. All right? And any instruction it gives, it is welcome, but not necessity. Okay? For poesy only instructs as it delights. So it instructs only when it can delight. It has to affect the soul as in it has to touch your soul. If it did not move you, it did not move you emotionally, then that poetry is, well, soulless. It has to excite the passions. It has to excite the passions as in whatever you feel, all your feelings should be excited by reading poetry. Move the admiration or fear. It has to move your admiration. You should feel in awe of the work, of the philosophy contained in it, or be afraid of it. Afraid as in like it should make your this, not afraid, but it has to make you feel all the more real about things. Whatever object, if whatever object is presented, whatever subject is presented, you should have a real admiration for it. Okay? Heighten the beauty of some parts and hide the deformities of the rest. Please bear this one particular sentence in mind. It does not mean that you have to forget the rest, but this particular sentence seems to encompass the idea Dryden insisted on, that poetry should work towards. Poetry has to heighten the beauty of some parts and hide the deformities of the rest, which means whatever concept the poetry is projecting, I mean, poetry is imitating the world, right? Whatever it is imitating, and when we speak of imitation, we try to imitate everything, good, bad, and the ugly. Now, Dryden does not want the ugly part. He does not want to project the bad part. He wants the writers, he wants the poets to project only the beautiful parts, the more good parts, okay, and hide the deformities, as in all the darker parts he wants to remove or somehow camouflage. Now, poet is neither teacher nor imitator, but a creator. So, according to Dryden, the poet is neither a teacher nor imitator. Well, Aristotle believed that he's an imitator, right? And well, Sidney believed that he is a teacher and imitator. But according to Dryden, sorry, according to Dryden, a poet is not merely a teacher or an imitator, but a creator. He creates anew. He creates something that is idealized, an idealized version of something that only exists with deformities in this world. So if you imitated blindly, you would be putting in all the deformities, all the ugliness alongside the beauty. So he wanted the poet, he sees the poet as someone who projects only that which is beautiful. Poetry is a work of art. So poet is neither teacher nor imitator, but a creator. And poetry itself, it's a work of art rather than a copy. Okay? The creator is creating something anew rather than merely imitating someone or me imitating something. Rather than merely creating a copy, the poet is creating a work of art. Aristotle, according to Aristotle, truths of poetry not to be confounded with the truths of life. Dryden seems to follow this precept, believing that there is truth of poetry, there is truths of life. Let us not confuse these two, because these are two very different things. Truths of life include everything, all the good, bad, and ugly, whereas the truths of poetry has to have only beauty. It has to give, only then it will be able to give you enough pleasure, aesthetic pleasure. Now, fancy gives the life touches. Now, fancy it could be used to mean imagination. So, imagination gives the life touches. It is what gives the life touches to any work of art. But fancy should be tempered by reason. So you cannot give in to fancy. You cannot give yourself in completely to imagination. Since Dryden belonged to the age of reason, they had a strong hold on reason. Okay, yes, imagination is necessary to create good poetry, but it has to have its limits, boundaries set by reason. Now, here we come to the part where we look into dramatic poetry. Dramatic poetry, as in Dryden's understanding of what drama should be like, what the the general concerns about drama were during his time. So basically, the drama in France, the practice of writing drama, writing plays in France was a little different from the way it was written in Britain. And consequently, the way the dramatists of France, the playwrights of France were believed to be more masterful in their writing as compared to the native writers. It irked Dryden to see that the native writers were not given their due credit. So first off, in France, all three unities were followed. So we've spoken about Aristotle's unities, right? So Aristotle, well, he speaks mainly of one kind of unity that to be followed, unity of action, that the character should not change itself, should not go any transform so much that it becomes unintelligible or disrupts the flow of the play. He does not insist on the time nor the place, unity of time nor unity of place. But then the French writers or the later Roman writers, they interpreted Aristotle's work in the sense that according to them, all three unities became paramount to the making of a successful play. So the dramatists of France, they strictly followed or adhered to all three unities, and they tried to avoid mixing of tragic and comic elements in their plays. Again, something that Aristotle strongly believed in. He believed that tragic comedy was a mongrel that is to be that is not to be tolerated. So the French dramatists, they avoided mixing of tragic and comic, and they also avoided scenes that were repugnant or unsavory. Repugnant as in things that were gross, grotesque. They tried to avoid it. Okay, they did not bring into the scene. They did not bring into the play as such. Okay, they were merely hinted at. Hints were given in dialogues rather than putting it on stage. Again, the spectators' power of belief wasn't strained by acting it on stage and was merely reported. So the spectators of power of belief, in the sense, whatever the spectator, I mean, you need to have a little suspension of disbelief, right? You need to be prepared to accept things that are going on in the stage and accord it some believability, right? So your power of belief is not strained by the French dramatists, because things that cannot be put on stage, they were merely reported about. See, for instance, battle scenes. Okay, battle scenes, as you could see in Shakespeare's play. At least as far as I know, there are some 14, 15 battle scenes in Shakespeare's plays, the entire Shakespeare, canon of Shakespeare's plays. So you see, that was something that these people avoided. The French dramatists avoided. Okay, the French dramatists strictly followed the three unities. They avoided mixing of tragic and comic elements in their plays. They avoided putting repugnant or unsavory scenes in the play itself and merely hinted at them. And they also avoided, creating scenes on stage that cannot be believed. Okay, that cannot be believed, in the sense the spectator's power of belief was not strained by acting it on stage and was merely reported. So as an example, Prasad speaks of the battle scenes. Battle scenes, they are generally not, you cannot really believe it when put on stage or a theater. As far as English drama is concerned, so this was something that was related to the French drama, okay, the French dramatists. Now, as far as the English drama is concerned, it seemed inferior in comparison to the French drama, for according to the people of this time. So even the great Elizabethans seemed coarse and crude. So great Elizabethans, in all the university wits, Shakespeare, Marlowe, everyone, they all looked coarse. They all looked crude when compared to the French dramatists, mainly because they had a certain order, certain strategy with which they worked, whereas these were more intuitive and more impulsive writers. Dryden, in his essay on dramatic poesy, Dryden's essay on dramatic poesy was written with the purpose to vindicate the honor of our English writers from the censure of those who unjustly prefer the French before them. So the main purpose of essay on dramatic poesy, written by Dryden, was that the honor of English writers was at a disadvantage, right? He wanted to vindicate them from the censure of those who unjustly prefer the French, as in he is biased in this case because, of course, he would love his native tradition as compared to the European tradition, right? So, Essay in Dramatic Poesy, it was first published in 1668 and was mainly influenced by Sir Philip Sidney. Remember An Apology for Poetry? Well, Dryden shaped his essay very much on Sidney's work. So it is in a dialogue form. So we see there are some four characters: Eugenius, Crates or Critus, Lycidius, and Neander. All these characters seem to argue about certain concepts, and in the sense that each one would try to talk about a particular form of rhyme or a particular metrical composition, and they would, I mean, certain meter, and for a particular, particular kind of drama, and the others would argue for or against it. Okay, so you get an overall view of each concept discussed. So these characters were based on real life characters of Dryden's time, whereas Eugenius was based on Charles Buckhurst, Critis on Sir Robert Howard, I believe, and Lycidius on Sir Charles Sidley, and Dryden on Neander. I think. I'm not very sure about who plays whom, which character belonged to whom. Anyway, the main topics of debate. The main topics of debate were the relative merit of classical versus modern drama. So they mainly discussed whether the classical writings were good or the modern drama was good. Okay, which one was better, which one was best, which was more developed. Okay, and then whether French drama is better than the English drama. Is the French drama good or the English drama? Whether plays in rhyme are an improvement upon blank verse drama. As in blank verse, as I might have mentioned this earlier, blank verse was unrhymed. Unrhymed iambic pentameter mostly. Mostly it's iambic pentameter, but it could vary. The meter could vary, but basically they are unrhymed. So whether rhyming is an improvement upon blank verse drama or is it a recession as such? Um, Play, a just and lively imitation of human nature in action. They understood that play was a just and lively imitation of human nature in action and tried to adhere to the unities by the French. And they were wondering if the adherence to unities by the French was valid or not. Was it sensible at all? And the use of rhyme and drama, we've already discussed this. Yeah, use of rhyme and drama. Should one use rhyme and drama or use unrhymed verses? Now, play, as we discussed earlier, is a just as in a very fair and absolute, perfect, and lively image of human nature. Okay, representing its passions and humors and the changes of fortune which it is subject, for the delight and instruction of mankind. It is mainly for the delight and instruction of mankind a play is made. And it is a just and lively image of human nature not in static, but in action. Okay? Representing its passions and humors. All the passions and humors are to be represented, and the change of fortunes which it is subject. So without this changes of fortune, a play would really be drab and dull. So English drama served this purpose. So they had a certain definition of play, what a play ought to be, what drama ought to be, and English drama served this purpose. So you need not think that only French dramatists were good, were creating good plays. Appeal from the rules of the classics to the laws of nature. First of all, there are classical rules, but you also have to take into consideration the laws of nature. What is natural cannot be inartistic, right? Since art only imitates nature. First of all, whatever you are going to imitate from nature, it is artistic. It cannot be inartistic because art imitates nature. Okay? In nature, joy and pain lie in close proximity to each other. You have to agree with that. Joy and pain come together. Joy does not exist all by itself. Pain always accompanies joy, and joy appears all the greater when it succeeds pain. You feel all the more joyous, all the more happy after a bout of pain, after a bout of unhappiness. So a nature is mixture of both joy and pain. A scene of mirth as in some joyous occasion, okay, from happiness. A scene of mirth mixed with tragedy has the same effect upon us which our music has betwixt the acts. So you remember there's always some music between each act, right? To bring in a certain levity to the serious situation of a tragedy. So if the tragedy is going on, or if a tragic play is going on, After each act, there would be a small space in which some music would be played, right? To reduce the to bring in some levity, so to reduce the gravity of the situation, right? So he says Dryden believes that a scene of mirth mixed with tragedy has the same effect upon us which our music has betwixt the acts, which we find a relief to us from the best plots and language of the stage if the discourses have been long. If the dialogues have been really long and the plots and the language of stage, everything is too much. The actors, the playwright introduce a small chorus, small song in the middle, so as to bring some relief to the gravity of the situation. So here he is mainly speaking about mixing of, you know, tragic and comic elements. So it is supposed to be good. Why? Because nature itself is composed of joy and pain. Attacking the tragic comic form. So first off, he is defending the English tragic comedy. Okay, defending the English tragic comedy. He says, to the honor of our nation, we have invented, increased, and perfected a more pleasant way of writing for the stage than was ever known to the ancients or moderns of any nation, which is tragic comedy. So the English, they were the ones to invent and increase and perfect tragic comedy. So this was something the ancients hadn't done it. Even they might have, you know, dabbled in tragic comedy. They did not perfect it. It was Shakespeare who perfected the art of writing tragic comedy. So he says it is an honor for our nation. Now, again, a couple of years later, in a parallel of poetry and painting, he attacks tragicomic form. See, he says, so he is contradicting himself. First, he writes this in his essay on dramatic poesy, and then, I believe it is an essay on dramatic poesy, and then in a parallel of poetry and painting, he attacks the tragicomic form, saying our English tragic comedy must be confessed to be wholly Gothic. Okay, it is Gothic as in something that is not well formed, gloomy. It's horrifying. Notwithstanding the success which it has found upon our theatre, in spite of the success it has found in the English theatre, it is still Gothic. For though the comical parts are diverting, though the comical parts, as in all the happy parts, are good for diverting our minds from the serious, more moving situations and the serious moving, yet they are often unnatural mingle. First, see, he calls it nature. Nature itself has both joy and pain. A scene of mirth mixed with tragedy has the same effect upon us. All of this he says. And then a couple of years later, he attacks it, saying that it is unnatural. Yet they are of an unnatural mingle, for mirth and gravity destroy each other. See, it's a self-contradictory statement. Of course, the kind of criticism he wrote is flawed to some degree, but then he is known as father of English criticism mainly because he created a certain structured the he's contradicting himself. That's why it's his criticism, though flawed, he brought in a certain structure to writing criticism as such. Okay, because see, before him, Sidney or Ben Jonson, they did not really. Sidney wrote one critical work. Ben Jonson, he had all these notes. Other than that, there was not exactly any critical tradition as such in English literature. So you see, that's despite all of his flaws, Dryden is considered as the father of English criticism. For mirth and gravity, okay, we finished this? Yeah. For mirth and gravity destroy each other and are no more to be allowed for decent than a gay widow laughing in a mourning habit. See, it is unnatural, just like a widow laughing in a mourning habit. A widow who is supposed to be mourning. Mourning habit here would be cloth, or mourning cloth, as in widows tend to wear black, right? Or when they're grieving for their husbands, deceased husbands, they tend to wear a mourning habit, a mourning cloth. So imagine a widow who's just lost her husband laughing outrageously. it is unnatural, right? So he says that mixing both tragic and comic elements in one play would be grossly outrageous and gothic. On the introduction of unpalatable or incredible scenes like battles and deaths, because see, they did not include battles or deaths in the classical literature, right? Classical dramas. And again, the French followed this precept. But the English defied all of this, and you would see so many deaths, and especially, you know, in Shakespeare's plays and even kids' plays, you see all of these deaths and battle scenes. So he says he sees nothing wrong with physical action, battles, duels, etc. For why may not our imagination as well suffer itself to be deluded with the probability of it as with any other thing in the play? Because whatever is being projected in the play, it is all imagined, and we are no, we are abutting that imagination with our own, right? We are using our imagination to make believe, to understand the make believe. So why not add this to it as well? I can with as great ease persuade myself that the blows are given in good earnest as I can that they who strike them are kings or princes or those persons which they represent. So if I can make myself believe that a certain character, certain person playing a certain role is king, a person playing the role of a servant is an actual servant. If I can make myself believe, if I can extend my imagination to believe all of those, why can't I stretch my imagination to also believe that the fight that is happening on stage is real as well? I mean, it is partly right. At least when you're sitting as an audience, you tend to believe it, to at least partly believe it, right? So why not use my suspension of disbelief to that as well? Speaking of the unities, he's it goes on quite a bit. I think we can complete it. Anyway, speaking of the unities, he speaks of how plot should be single, the time of action 24 hours, and the place the same throughout. It is the accepted interpretation of Aristotle's unity. But unity of place was never mentioned by Aristotle, and neither was unity of time. It was violated by Terence often enough. The French made them the precept of the stage. They made it as a rule for the stage. Okay, it was only mentioned only in passing, but the French made it as a rule for creating good drama. Unity of action, coordinated whole. So this main concept Aristotle, the main concept, not concept, the main precept Aristotle laid down was the unity of action. And this unity of action was necessary to bring in the play as a coordinated whole, okay? Because the action was what created the characterization, right? So any subplot can be interwoven into the main plot. Again, Aristotle did not want any subplots, did not want any diversions or distractions from the main action. But Dryden believes that you can weave any amount of subplots into the main plot so long as it helped move the main plot, okay, so long as it helped in its progression. So speaking of the subplots, Dryden says that it will not be difficult to imagine how the underplot, which is only different, not contrary to the great design, may naturally be conducted along with it. So the underplot, the subplot, as you see in, there are so many subplots in Shakespearean plays. For instance, there is Jessica and Lorenzo. I believe it is Lorenzo in Merchant of Venice. There is an alternate subplot going on. And if you went for King Lear, you would find Gloucester and Edmund and Edward, a subplot going parallel to King Lear and his daughters. And if you look at or even the subplot in As You Like It, you have three subplots going on, right? Apart from Rosalind and what was his name? Oh, you have Celia and Oliver, and then you have Touchstone, and then Audrey and Touchstone, and you have Sylvius, right? Phoebe and Sylvius. So subplots do not really, even though they are different, they do not act as contrary to the great design. As in, they do not take away from the main theme from it does not steal away from Antonio Bassanio relationship, or between from Bassanio and Portia's relationship. It does not take away from the main character progression going on in As You Like It from Rosalind. It does not do that. It, in fact, it can be naturally conducted along with it. It can go side by side along with the main plot. Unities and lack of underplots led to dearth of plot and narrowness of imagination in the French drama. So he points out how French drama was weakened because of the narrowness. Their imagination was becoming narrowed, and because of the strict adherence to unities, and because of the lack in underplots, their plot was devoid of any complexity. Okay, and because of many of the very simple plots they had, the French drama was weakened. Speaking of unity of time, he says if the audience can be deluded into believing the stage time of 3 hours to be 24 in life, it can as easily be believing it to be a few days or even a longer time. So you see, they spoke of how one play should not constitute more than 24 hours, like one revolution of sun, right? So he says, if if the audience can believe, believe in the illusion that the play that is of, say, 1 hour play could encompass a 24-hour time in a normal life, of a real life, why can't they believe it to be a few days or even few months or a couple of years? It can be done. And speaking of unity of place, he says if the audience can imagine it to be a garden in the first act, why can it not imagine it to be a camp in the next? What is the problem in that place, in the movement of place? If the time taken by the intervening events warrants the change, that is, like if the time that is required for change of action from one place to another, if it is adequate enough, what problem is there in the change of place, right? Why does it have to be monotonous? Then, speaking of the nature of drama, he says play is a fiction. It is fiction based on reason. You have to understand that play is nothing but a fiction. It has a fictive quality. And this fiction is based on reason. It is made reasonable. Okay? Fancy and reason go hand in hand. The first cannot leave the last behind. Both fancy, that is imagination, and your reasoning ability, both has to go hand in hand in a drama. So the first alone cannot go, leaving the last behind. Though fancy, when it sees the wide gulf, would venture over as a nimbler, yet it is withheld by reason, which will refuse to take the leap when the distance over it appears too large. So the fancy itself may carry you forward onward without any inhibitions or control, whereas reason is what gives control to fancy. That is how a good poetic work, good drama could be created. So even though you may bring in all sorts of preposterous elements, say for instance, Twelfth Night. I'm giving a lot of reference of Shakespeare, but I can't think of anything else to base the examples on. So if you consider Twelfth Night, there are all sorts of preposterous elements like Ariel and Caliban. You it is all fanciful, yeah. They have a fictive quality to it, whereas it is only made reasonable because of the interaction of Prospero, right? Because of the interaction, the very humane qualities given to Ariel and Caliban, they are made more believable. Yeah, consider Malov's Mephistopheles. It is a fanciful. I mean, I should not restrict it to the creatures, the non-human creatures alone, but anything, any situation or any any characterization, you you come across in any play, it is fanciful. It is a work of imagination, though based on reality, right? But this imagination needs certain limitations, it needs certain boundaries, and these boundaries are set by reason to make them believable. Okay, so yes, Dryden concluded that the unities gave drama little scope for for development of plot and character. So Dryden believed that unities restricted the development of both plot and character. Now, Cornell himself, initially I told you that Dryden based his criticism, or he developed his criticism on Cornell and Montaigne's writing, right? So Cornell himself, after long practice, was inclined to think that the time allotted by the ancients was too short to raise and finish a great action, and better a mechanic rule was stretched or broken than a great beauty were omitted. So you see, Cornell, he himself said after long practice and after experiencing much, he himself said or believed that the time allotted by the ancients, that is, a revolution of one sun, one day was too short a time to create any great action, to raise and finish a great action. And it is better to break certain rules, certain mechanic rules that is flawed. Okay, it is better to stretch and break those rules rather than omit something that is really beautiful, something of great beauty. As far as his value of criticism is concerned, he was the father of English criticism as a writer who first taught us to determine upon principles the merit of composition. So he brought in all those principles with which to judge the merit of any composition, and that's why he has been accorded this esteemed position of being father of English criticism by Dr. Samuel Johnson. With Dryden begins a regular era of criticism. He showed what makes for greatness in literature, though colored by his cultural nationalism. Cultural nationalism, as in, he had this affection for his native tradition. Despite it all, no problem escaped his attention. Okay, he dealt with everything that came across him in his analysis or his observation of drama. The nature and function of poetry, tragedy, comedy, epic, satire, the other kinds, the question of tragic comedy, the unities, rhyme and blank verse, the harmony of prose, the critical art itself, everything he tried to write upon, to critique upon. That is all for now. Thank you so much for your patient listening. Stay safe, be happy. Assalamu alaikum.